Welcome. We're honored to have you listen and participate in these dialogues produced by the Cora de Broutsau Foundation. To learn more about the Foundation and about how you can help us in our mission of unearthing untold stories of moral energy, please visit us at virtuesofpeace.com. There you can access show archives, show resources, visit our Etsy shop, and support us with a donation. virtuesofpeace.com.
Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May and I'm joined by Michael Buzzy and Randy Olson. And we are recording this show on June 8th, 2021. And it was just yesterday that we marked the 50th anniversary of a really important occasion, which you may not know about, but we have discussed on an earlier show. And that is when Evelyn Grubb, you may not know who she is, but we'll talk about her, submitted to the United Nations a petition on behalf of herself, her children, and all similarly situated families. And these are families of the prisoners of war missing in action in the Vietnam War. So we have done a show on this back in December, on December 10th, which is Human Rights Day, because this show and last show is about the fundamental human rights of Evelyn Grubb, her family, and all similarly situated families of the POW MIA. So we have done a show on that. You can link to that on our show resources page, and we encourage you to check out that earlier show, which we really did a deep dive into something called the right to truth. That is really, the right to truth is really the sort of label that is used today in international law concerning the rights of families to be informed about the missing or the disappeared. And so that's a kind of different context, but the right to truth is an emerging norm in international law. And we focused on that on our last show. On this show, we're taking another look at this petition and focusing on the two different but related legal instruments that are mentioned in Evelyn's petition. And number one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the second one is the Geneva Convention number 3. And we're going to talk about these two different legal instruments, how they are different, and also how they are used in Evelyn Grubb's petition. It is my contention that this petition, which is now 50 years old, is so forward-thinking and prescient in the development of international law. And international law, as we talk about on this show, is a living, growing organism. It evolves over time, and you can trace an evolution of humanitarian and human rights norms. And we try to do that in this show. And what Evelyn Grubb does in this position, with the assistance of a team of lawyers, is to really chart out where international law is going. And as I will try to explain, the Geneva Conventions and the work of the International Committee of the Red Cross are such an important seed, if you will, that continues to blossom. And so that's where we're going today. Before we begin talking about those legal instruments, we're just going to do a little bit of background on Evelyn Grubb and the Grubb family, her husband, Nuke Grubb, and her children. And I know, Randy, you have like a sort of more summary version of this. So let's start with you and just sort of remind us of the important details about the Grubb family.
Sure. So my objective is to spell it out in as simple of a narrative as possible. So we have a man who goes to war. He joins the Air Force. He's shot down in enemy territory, and photos are taken of him being treated humanely. And these photos are used as part of a public campaign to construct a certain narrative. He's then killed, or perhaps, if you prefer, executed. But this fact is not made known. And the pictures are circulated of him being treated humanely for a long time after he's killed. Meanwhile, the wife in this situation, Evelyn Grubb, moves heaven and earth to get details about her husband. And in so doing, she establishes this firm legal foundation for the right to know, or the right to truth. So, as far as I can tell, we're going to be concentrating today on unpacking what it is that she constructed and how her story has built something like a foundational pillar for us to think about war in context of its impact on families, and superimposing this conversation about duties and rights onto that story. So what does a family deserve? What does she deserve? And what do we owe? Like, what does the government owe to its soldiers? What do enemies owe to enemy soldiers? Stuff like this. So we're going to be unpacking a lot of that as far as I hope that's where we're going.
Yeah, well said. And I just want to say this way that you put it, like, what do we owe? What does the government owe to its soldiers, to the family of the soldiers, to the quote unquote enemy? And I just want to throw it out now, let it percolate. This whole idea of like owing something, and debt could be either sufficiently ripened into a law, right? So there are legal debts or duties or obligations, or it could be a moral debt, duty, obligation. And sometimes they overlap, but I think it's really important to clarify and to keep distinct, at least in our minds for now, that the things owed could be ripened into actual law, or it could be some other norm. And with Evelyn Grubb's petition, she is, as you say, like laying the foundation for a pillar, or like further growing a seed that was already planted, that is growing into more and more specific legal obligations. So we'll get there, but yeah, I just wanted to make the distinction between what we owe to each other legally and what we owe to each other morally. And over to you, Michael.
Yes, thank you. And Randy did a really nice job of laying out the broad framework of the story, and then how this percolates into Evelyn Grubb's petition, and then all the international law, rights, duties, complexities that Hope had laid out as well. So I guess I will just take it and sort of fill in the details of who Evelyn Grubb was, who her husband Newt Grubb was, and how we end up getting to June of 1971, when Evelyn finally presents her petition to the United Nations. So we begin in January of 1966. Evelyn Grubb is 35 years old. She is the mother of 3, pregnant with her 4th child. They're all boys. Her oldest son, Jeffrey, is 9. Her middle child, Roland, is 5. And then her youngest child, Stephen, who also goes by Van, he's only 2. So she has very young children. And so it is this early January morning. From hearing from the sons themselves, which has been a huge honor, they had described that they lived in Petersburg, Virginia, and it had just been a snowstorm. So snow covered anywhere. And a Western Union telegram driver had come to the house and had knocked on the door. And the sons remember describing that this was odd because there was such an immense amount of snow, and that even Evelyn herself known that this must be serious and something must have gone wrong for someone to be coming. Her husband, who Lieutenant Colonel Wilmer Newland Nuke Grubb was flying a reconnaissance mission. He was in the Air Force flying a reconnaissance mission in North Vietnam. And the telegram that she receives from the Western Union driver states that he has been shot down on his mission. And then she is utterly stunned by this news. The children run to the neighbor's house to try to seek help as Evelyn is completely beside herself. So Nuke Grubb, who is flying his reconnaissance mission in North Vietnam, is shot down by an elite unit known as C4 anti-aircraft unit of the North Vietnamese army. This was a big deal for them since it was the first time they had ever shot down an American fighter plane, and in the subsequent capture of Nuke Grubb since he was still alive. And so weeks passed back in the United States for Evelyn, of unsure of where her husband is, whether he had survived. His status was listed as missing in action. And then in early to mid-February, she receives a phone call from a friend of hers on the West Coast saying that her friend had seen in the newspaper a photograph of her husband, the one that Randy had mentioned, being treated by a Vietnamese nurse, which rekindled Evelyn's hope that her husband was still alive. And so this is really the spark in the catalyst, and his status is changed from missing in action to prisoner of war, since he's assumed to be subsequently captured by the North Vietnamese. And then this is the thing that spurs Evelyn to, and gives her that hope that if she were to work towards and for the release of her husband, that she may eventually be united with him once again. And then many wives and families across the United States had been in similar experiences that Evelyn had, that they had lost sons, they had lost husbands, they had no contact with them, they did not know their status, whether they were missing, whether they were dead, whether they were prisoners of war. And so then this starts to allude to where the duty of the government comes in to inform families of this. And so Evelyn bands together with many other families and wives who were in similar situations as her to form the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. And that it is through this vehicle and organization that she goes on to eventually become the head of, and then petition the United States, meeting with Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, and then the President, Richard Nixon, to force and hold them to account that there is a duty that exists for them to inform families of the status of their lost loved ones. And so then this eventually extends to the international level when she petitions the United Nations 5 years after her husband is shot down in 1971 to hold all nations to account and to remind them of these various international legal instruments, that some right or duty exists for these families to know the status of their loved ones who are missing. And then I can fill in how it ends. So then in 1973, Operation Homecoming begins, of the release of prisoners of war from North Vietnam as the Vietnam War is winding down. And then Evelyn comes to find that tragically, Nuke Grubb was not among the ones who had survived. And then it is not until 1974 that his remains are eventually returned home to the United States. And so what I find so incredibly powerful about this story is that it starts off so individualistic, of just an individual wanting to be reunited with their spouse and for the sake of family cohesion and the love that is shared there. But the activism of Evelyn Grubb ends up extending to this national and international level that impacts many individuals and who are also in similar situations as her, which then in turn also is so impactful for them on an individual level. So it starts on this individual for Evelyn Grubb in particular, then extends to these large supranational structures such as the United Nations, but then returns to this individual level of just merely reuniting or gaining information about those who had been missing. And so that is where then the petition comes in 1971, and then Nuke Grubb's remains returned to the United States in 1974.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well said. And this information, we should also say, continues to unfold, and we would be remiss if we didn't give, deep thanks to the team at Fruits of Peace, Kevin Settle. And I just also want to extend thanks to Steve, also known as Van Grubb, for working with Kevin to get me some of these documents from the family files that helped to create this show and our show back in December. So just a shout out to them. They have a great Facebook page, Fruits of Peace, and that story continues to be told and information continues to come out. So Right. So as you mentioned, Michael, in 1974, finally, Nuke Grubb's remains are returned to the United States, and he is interred at Arlington National Cemetery. And let's go back to, dial back a bit to 1971, when Evelyn Grubb submits her petition to the United Nations. I just want to dial back like a year before that, 1970. And the circumstances, as I understand it, and this is in the book, the wonderful book, You Are Not Forgotten, by Evelyn Grubb and Carol Joes, about this incredible story. And in chapter 6, and then let me just share the title of the chapter. It's called Reaction and Resolve. Great title. Reaction to what? In 1970, Evelyn Grubb learns that from Cora Weis, who is working for the National Family of Liaison, I think it's called, and she's, I don't want to, we can do a whole show on Cora Weiss, but she is in communication with North Vietnam. And in 1970, I think it's November 1970, Cora Weiss learns that a number of prisoners have died. And Nuke Grubb is amongst those prisoners. I think it's 6 different prisoners. And this information is shared with the State Department. And someone, I think at the Air Force, calls Evelyn in November 1970 and says, we have some disturbing news. And Cora Weiss has been in contact with the State Department. And she has information that 6 POWs have died, and Nuke's name is among the 6. And she's going to have a press conference tomorrow. And she's gonna release this information, and we just want you to know this first. And so this is a phone call that Evelyn gets, in 1970. And this is the way that she begins to learn about the live possibility that Nuke Grubb is no longer alive. And the book does such a wonderful job of transmitting the emotion involved. And when this information hits Evelyn, and I think there's a lot of humiliation going on. It's humiliation because the information is coming from Cora Weiss, who is talking with the North Vietnamese. It's not coming from an official government channel. And it's just this information also in the context of, as you were talking about, both of you, this campaign, this propaganda campaign by the North Vietnamese of like releasing these pictures. And so there's this expectation and hope that he's still alive. And so then this news comes. And it's just very painful, very humiliating. And here's the extraordinary thing that Evelyn does. In the midst of this information, what does she do? She goes to read the Geneva Conventions. I mean, I just want to pause and note the wisdom of that in the midst of this information, she goes to read, and she goes to read her pamphlets. I think there's several on the Geneva Conventions, and one particular on the Third Geneva Convention. And she starts to read it. And she's realizing that what this thing says is not jibing with what just happened. And that is, there's a provision of the Third Geneva Convention, because there's 4, and we'll talk about them in a minute, that requires the detaining state, so the North Vietnam, to, if there's a death, to communicate that through official channels with like very specific information that complies with a form, and it's laid out in a very specific way. But this information is not coming to Evelyn through that specific way outlined in the Geneva Convention. And she realizes that this is not, like, what's happening to me is not conforming with this law. And then, of course, she looks up who are the signatories of this law. And she realizes that, we have this law and people are not obeying it. It's not being implemented. And so I need to do something. I just think like that, like what I just said, like she reads and it's like they're not doing it. And I see that they're not doing it. So I have to do it. And she does. And the book talks about how her mother, Evelyn's mother, is like, let it go. And Evelyn just cannot do that. That there's such like a deep wrong, and I think so much pain that she is carrying, that she has no other option to discharge it through this sequence of extraordinary actions and ideas. And so that's the sort of like emotional context of how the petition comes about, because basically she gets this information and the National League of Families is already working with some lawyers, and there's she starts to contact them and other lawyers about her idea of holding accountable, whatever that means back in the 70s, because there is no international criminal court. But so like what happens if the Geneva Conventions are not being complied by a foreign power? Like what can we do? Can we prosecute? Not back in 1971, right? There is no international criminal court. But what she wants to do is just simply do something to implement and hold accountable countries that are not obeying the Geneva Convention, specifically the Third Geneva Convention. And she also adds on to her argument the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's sort of like where the energy and impetus for this petition comes from that being disclosed of Nuke's probable death, because it's not coming through official channels, by Cora Weis. And the other thing that is mentioned in the book, and I think it's absolutely right, with all due respect to Cora Weiss, who I consider a friend, I've met her a couple of times, but Cora Weiss does not communicate to the families this information first. It's like she does her press conference, and maybe she can, like, it's easier for us to judge, but there is definitely this pain felt, especially by Evelyn, that Cora Weiss does not like reach out to the families first before having a press conference. And that's like a double blow, right? It's just like a kind of disregard for this extreme pain that is being borne by this family. I'm just going to stop and see if anybody has anything to add or any thoughts about the sort of context, the emotional context of the petition. So that's the end of 1970 that happens, where she gets the call, and then she starts to call lawyers, and they start to draft this petition, which is presented to the, I think it's the main secretary in June of 1971. So 50 years to the day yesterday. Go ahead, Randy.
So I just want to like pull out of the details and do my dog and pony show, so to speak. I always like to try to frame things, and this story, as far as I can tell, can be framed around a simple idea of like the question of what if is crippling. And do people have a right to know the whereabouts of their family? And when information about the whereabouts of people's families are discovered, how is that information going to be handled?
Mm-hmm.
Like those three questions are at the heart of what we're trying to explore today. And it seems obvious, right? But when you start to get into the implementation and the details of a strategy, it starts to be very, very tricky. And so I just wanted to put that as a box kind of around what we're doing. It's like, what if? That's a horribly crippling thing in some situations. And how to properly factor that in to legislation is the dialogue.
Yeah, well said. So as you both know, the last couple of shows that we've done have been on Howard Thurman, who provided the spiritual and philosophical foundation for the nonviolent wing of the civil rights movement. Extremely important, first African American to meet with Gandhi in 1936. He says that hatred, enmity, the hounds of hell, as he calls them, are produced by contact without fellowship. Contact without fellowship. And I think that when we talk about, okay, what if, and how should this information, there's like, yeah, how should this information be transmitted? I would like to propose that a principle that however it is transmitted, it is done in a way that respects the principle of contact with fellowship, with care, right? With concern, with sensitivity to suffering. And that's not done here. And that's part of the pain that is being borne. And quite frankly, like we're still all, drunk and in a trance. And we're absolutely, when we're in conflict, we're absolutely in drunk, stoned out of our gourd and in a trance. And it's hard to navigate with, all of the blinders off. But, and so it's easy for us to, judge, but like going forward, and this is why like this is called duty to remember, like let us remember this as we go forward. Any kind of transmission of painful information must be done in a way that respects the principle of contact with fellowship. I'll just throw that out. Michael?
I really like that, the principle of contact of fellowship, and I even know from having seen the Fruits of Peace documentary and then also reading and gathering all the information for the whole process that has been duty to remember. Cora Weiss was a pretty controversial individual, if I remember correctly, that her contact with the North Vietnamese was not seen in very praiseworthy light here in the United States. And so maybe in the sense that the information should have been conveyed to these families before her press conference, which I definitely agree. It should have been, that it's not respecting those that intimate connection of family and that need on an individual level to have that information before it is disseminated to the public at large. But then from whatever channels she was reverberating within, pressures from all the sides, that maybe that contact of fellowship was not something she was particularly attuned to or feeling in those moments either. But I think in terms of what Evelyn Grubb does with this information and just going to read the Third Geneva Convention, you had mentioned the quote before we had begun, Hope, the swift answer of my soul says it must be done. That resonated with me in terms of what Evelyn does, that it is just this very simplistic thinking in that this is the process that is meant to be followed. It has not been followed. Thus, there must be some sort of remedy in the international legal realm in which this situation can be rectified. And so I thought that was a very, very profound, very yet so simplistic way in which Evelyn Grubb processes such an immense loss and only seems to further propel her along to what eventually culminates within her United Nations petition, which has huge ramifications for everyone who ends up being in the position that she was in that moment.
Mm-hmm, indeed. Yes. And the swift answer was from my soul was it must be done. That's from Adelaide Johnson in 1920. And I just want to say also that that's so like resonant with Eleanor Roosevelt, okay, who ushered in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is one of these documents, if we ever get to it today, and it's okay if we don't, but again, it's the Geneva Conventions is one of the things that Evelyn Grubb looks at, and that's what she first starts to read. But there's this other thing in her petition, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was ushered in by Eleanor Roosevelt, who writes about what is democracy, but doing that which needs to be done when you see it needs to be done. And so she uses the example of you see a pothole in your neighborhood. And if you see the pothole, you don't wait for someone else to fix it. If you see it, you fix it. You do the thing. That is democracy. Or as Hamza Khan says, democracy is like, I must do it. It's me to do it. And so that's it. Like that's what Evelyn Grubb is doing. She's doing it because no one else is doing it and she sees it needs to be done. So yeah. She's the one to do it. I'm going to read, this is on page 143 from that incredible book, You Are Not Forgotten. Praise be to Evelyn Grubb and Carol Joes, who finished this book, which Evelyn wanted to do for a long time, and she just persisted and kept pestering Carol Joes to do it, and thank God we have it. And she talks about it on page 142. She says, after Cora Weiss's press conference, I began rereading my copy of the Geneva Conventions, most particularly the section about prisoners who die in captivity. And she quotes the article 121 there about how a very specific process needs to be followed by the detaining state, the detaining power. And after that quote from the Geneva Convention, Evelyn goes on, every time I read the Geneva Conventions, I was overcome with admiration and respect for the group that had drafted them. I saw how thorough they were in covering every aspect of war and the prisoners of war, although they had been written decades earlier. I read again the small booklet that contained the third convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war and wondered how many people in the United States government knew what the conventions contained. Everyone talks about them, but I don't believe many people have ever actually read them. Looking over the list of signing nations, I noted that none were paying attention to or attempting to enforce the Geneva Conventions as they had been charged with doing as signatories. And North Vietnam had done nothing that Article 120 and 121 required them to do. All we'd gotten from Cora Weiss and the Air Force had gotten was that Nuke Grubb was one of the 6 men listed as dead, unquote. That's on page 143. And so that's the context. Now, as I've mentioned, we have the Geneva Conventions and number 3, and there are 4 Geneva Conventions. We're going to talk about them in a minute. But first, there's the Geneva Conventions that are relevant to the petition and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I just want to take a couple minutes to just clarify the distinction between these 2 different things. And then we'll talk about how they're applied if we have the time. If not, we'll come back next week. But the Geneva Conventions are different than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Geneva Conventions apply only in armed conflict. So the Geneva Conventions, also sometimes called the law of armed conflict or humanitarian law or a part of humanitarian law, but these are like the rules of war, and part of those rules concerns the treatment of POWs, okay? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't just apply only in war, it applies at all time, at all time. The Geneva Conventions are binding international law. That is, there's a treaty, countries had to sign and then ratify. Every country and its implementation of international law differs. In the United States, the Senate has to finally ratify a treaty. It's a very, very long process. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's debatable whether it's international law. It's definitely not a treaty. The declaration, it's a declaration, like the Declaration of Independence is not the Constitution. It's a declaration. It's a statement of philosophical principles. That there were instruments that were added onto the Declaration of Human Rights. So these international covenants, I don't want to get, this is not a show on on the details of international human rights law, because that's what we're talking about now. But just know that definitely the Geneva Conventions are binding international law, whereas the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's debatable. The Geneva Conventions are much older than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first Geneva Convention was ratified, implemented, actualized in 1864, and not by this country. The United States did not implement the first Geneva Convention until some years later. Okay, but 1864 is when the idea comes to life. This is the first Geneva Convention. Such an important story. In 1864, the first Geneva Convention just basically concerned the treatment of combatants and the wounded on land. And how I like to describe it is just like, just don't further maim them, and don't shoot the people wearing the sign of the Red Cross because they're the medics, and the rules are don't shoot on them. So that's the first Geneva Convention, has to do with land. Second Geneva Convention, sea. Third Geneva Convention, prisoners of war. Fourth Geneva Convention, civilians. We'll talk more about them later, but just getting out, there's 4 different Geneva Conventions. Okay. That's not just Geneva Conventions, 4 different Geneva Conventions. And the third one concerns prisoners of war. That's, of course, relevant to the Grubb story. And it's the third Geneva Convention that is used in the UN petition. Okay. So it's a little bit about the Geneva Conventions versus the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Does anybody, either of you, have anything to add about the differences between those two instruments of what we call public international law? Randy.
All I'll bring up is that there's a lot of emphasis in the UDHR and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights about like material provisions and expectations about certain kinds of things that individual people deserve outside of the context of war.
Yes.
And so it's like they're not really addressing the same. There's overlap, but there are significantly different documents. So that's all.
Yeah, cool. Right, like economic, social, and cultural rights. So the right to Social Security is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And again, this goes back to my information before about Eleanor Roosevelt. Like Roosevelt's 4 freedoms are in the preamble. Like Roosevelt is, and that philosophy is all over this document. But indeed, right to paid leisure time is in there. Right to education is in there. So yes, these apply at all times, as I said, not just wartime, but war and peacetime. And the Geneva Conventions apply, and specifically, it's a narrower context where the Geneva Conventions are applying. Anything else before we go on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Yes, before we just move to the UDHR, I just think that interplay between the practical legal side of things in international law in the Geneva Conventions, and then this broad sort of more philosophical moral aspect that the UDHR, but also applies very practically on the individual level, is sort of occupies this philosophical realm. The interplay of those two in Evelyns petition and laying out the framework and holding these nations to account of the rights and duties is very profound, and shows that each sort of helps to inform the other, and drawing from both can really help to propel something to around that impacts both broadly and on a very individual level.
Yes, indeed. And as I said, the Geneva Conventions are much older, so 1864, whereas the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is born after the atrocities of World War II. Its date of acceptance by the UN General Assembly is December 10th, 1948. Okay, so this is after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, concentration camps, carpet bombing, what have you. And the insight here, like this philosophical framework that you're talking about, Michael, that's in the UDHR, is basically, the sort of the global international response to the horrors of World War II. And let's not do that again. As I think both of you know, and when I teach this, it's like waking up from a month of being drunk or even a night and going, I don't want to do that again. And so how do we build institutions, laws, et cetera, that prevent this utter, absent-mindedness? Okay. And so also connected to this and to Evelyn Grubb's main mission, which is accountability. Like, North Vietnam is not obeying the law. So like, what can we do? We have to hold them accountable, take them to task, something. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is adopted the day after the Genocide Convention is adopted. That's December 9th, 1948. And so what's happening is, the Nuremberg trials, and there's a change in international law, which basically is starting to say, look, there are certain things that a state cannot do with impunity. That is, they can't just get away with it. So we've talked about this on this show a lot, but this is what's beginning to happen right after World War II. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is part of that. And I definitely think Evelyn Grubb is like, look, they can't get away with this. There's this, they said they would uphold the law. So, right, how do we build the world where they don't get away with it? And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, the International Criminal Court, and all these other things are part of this attempt to hold us accountable to standards that create a more humane world. So on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and how does Evelyn Grubb use this in her petition? So this is what's called the first contention in her petition. And I'm just going to read, this comes directly from the petition. It says, and I quote, "It is my sincere conviction and my earnest contention that this special relationship between members of the family unit, which the United Nations has pledged to protect, requires the recognition of the fundamental human right of family members to know whether other family members are living or dead. There is a particular relationship, a natural dependency by all the family on the head of the family, by the wife on her husband, by the children on their father, which reinforces the right to know the truth with certainty when the status in question is that of the head of the family, the husband and father on whom the others depend by nature and civilized custom." So that's the end of quote. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as the petition points out, the family is mentioned as this fundamental unit of society that's deserving of protection. And so in this quote that I just read, there's this gloss on that, this family structure where you have the head of a family, and this is the language, reinforces the right to know the truth. And I just want to spend some time on that. So the strategy here is to focus on, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the duty of the United Nations, which is just its member states. Okay, so the United Nations is its member states. So if this duty is going to be implemented and brought to life, it's going to be done at this individual state level by the country members. And so that's where the quote unquote rubber meets the road, if you will. And so the point is, look, all of these different members of the United Nations have pledged to protect the human family. And this involves this right to know with certainty whether the head of household is dead or alive. And I just want to discuss this claim that the right to know the truth is reinforced when we think about the truth about the head of the household. So in this case, Nuke Grubb is the head of the household. And so even more like reinforces the right to know what's happening with him because he's the head of the household. I agree that the right to know the truth with certainty is reinforced when the status in question is the head of the family. But I want to just throw out there that that family structure and the head of the family is not necessary for this right to know the truth, right? So we could have, and this is what's happening in our family structures where it's not so much a hierarchy, but a partnership. There's no head. There are like equal positions of influence and power, if you will. And that also, my intuition tells me, is protected, that kind of relationship in the family, even if it's not, there's not a head of household structure. So I think I've been speaking too much. So I'm going to stop and see if anybody else wants to, jump in on this kind of claim here. Randy.
I want to address that, but I want to step back for a second first and construct it a little in a way that I can move around in a little better.
Mm-hmm.
So the primary question is, do people have a right to know the whereabouts of their family? Now, and then zooming in closer, okay, so maybe not all people, not all the time, but what about when one of the people in the family signs up to be part of the military, right? So part of that contract with the government body implies that the government is going to know about where you're at and convey that information to the family in some way. And so far, I think that it's hard to wiggle around there. Like part of the contract definitely has that in there. The hang up starts to be when there's confusion about the location or the status. And I think that's where this case starts to be really significant, because it zooms in on this question of when a person's status goes between prisoner of war versus missing in action, because those are not the same thing.
Or dead.
Or killed in action, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those separate distinctions, they all are built on a certain kind of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And the law in the Geneva Convention is creating a responsibility to the government to create a structure which will seek out information and relay that information to the families.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so within that frame, it's like, does it matter whether or not the person is the head of household? Well, I think that the only sticking point has to do with who signed the contract with the government or with the military. Like whoever signed up,
Mm-hmm.
that person has a claim to the sets of resources allocated to information about their whereabouts, regardless of, whether they're the 18-year-old boy or the father of a family. Like, it doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
what the status is of the family member, as far as I can tell. It's like, if you sign up, part of the package is information about your whereabouts to the family.
Mm-hmm. And so what I hear you saying is that the family's right to truth, right, about the status of their family member is just as strong, whether the family member is the quote head of household or is the son, right?
Yes.
Right.
I think that the family member's designation in the household would be insignificant, whether you are
right.
Whether you're the third son or the 12th son in the family.
Mm-hmm.
Should not be a deciding factor as to whether or not mom knows that you've been
Mm-hmm.
shot.
Yeah, the quote here says not that the right to know is only invoked if the head of household status is unknown, but that if there is a head of household, the language is that reinforces the right to know. But what I hear you saying, Randy, is that there is no reinforcement. It's all equal in magnitude. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I stress that because when it comes to the actual implementation of such a thing, when we get into the bureaucratic mess, the paperwork, the blah, 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 there would be preferential treatment to people who are in a certain position in a family. And I have a feeling that that would not be good. Like that seems like there would be certain people would get worse worse information delivery mechanisms set in motion because they don't have children, for example. But like there are plenty of people who are married whose wives certainly or whose husbands or who whatever like spouses deserve to know whether or not you're the head of a family.
Mhm,
It seems equally significant.
mhm,
And yeah, I think that when you start to give preferential treatment to a certain class of soldier in this situation, it creates like a false sense of importance
mhm,
in a situation.
mhm,
So I don't know. I mean, I totally understand the argument,
mhm.
but I think that the implementation component of that it starts to make it starts to make things worse.
Mm. Yeah, and we have to like pay attention to the social context of this petition because this is written at a time, a very different time for women. I mean, this was the structure of the family, pretty much. I mean, this was the dominant structure of the family in the 1970s. Absolute, like, so it's perhaps easy for us to, yeah, sort of critique this thing, but and I think the urgency there. I think we need to take the social context into account as we critique it and understand that I can understand that if a family member is like, so dependent, and the thing is, and this has come out on our earlier shows that we did with Fruits of Peace and the Grubb family, that because of this dominant family structure, and also, I hate the word patriarchy. I am a student of Virginia Woolf, and I don't like the word feminism either, but I'll just use that word as a shorthand. The structure of society was designed such that there's this premise of the head of household, and women needed their husband's signature to get a credit card or take out loans. And this was part of the problem that was being encountered by Evelyn Grubb, that because this information was not forthcoming and hence the status was ambiguous, because like with death, that's a definite like, different status from POW to death. And then once death is invoked as the status, then a whole new suite of rights triggers for Evelyn Grubb. That is, she doesn't need her husband's signature to like do financial transactions and so forth. And so that urgency there is supervening on a patriarchal legal structure that has been being dismantled. It's still being dismantled. There's still remnants of it very much there. And that's why we're able to have, the judgment that we do. But yeah, I just wanted to note that.
Yeah, I mean, real quick, this is an invitation for me to look and see whether, you know, whether like whether a wife in the 1970s whose husband is off overseas in a conflict
Mhm,
is allowed to sign for her own financial expenses or not. Like
mhm,
whether or not the actual like contract and the arrangement starts to change some of the limitations on marriage or not. That seems like something that is worth looking into, but I'm totally green as grass there.
Yeah, I'm virtually certain, and it's in the book, and I believe it's come up in prior conversations that, and this of course depends on the laws of the state, and this is partly why lawyers were working with the National League of Families, because their husbands were in this ambiguous legal state. And I don't mean like state in terms of like domicile and, you know, political entity. I mean like psychological state. But in any case, this the state where you are geographically determines the specific rights and duties that you have qua wife. Okay, and the status of their husbands being ambiguous was preventing them from taking out loans, getting credit cards. Like this is a fact. Okay, so and this is mentioned in the book, and it has come up in prior shows. And this was like a difficulty encountered by Evelyn Grubb. And this is why lawyers started working with the families to work with the government, because the government is just kind of like they just don't, like, quite frankly, recognize families. You know, they don't recognize the impact of this practice on families, and that this whole missing man, like the missing is a totally new chapter in this. And so, yeah, this is why the story is so important to recall. So yeah, I will also get more clear on the details, since Randy, you said you're green about it, and like point to specifics. All I can do is point to vague recollections of the book and prior conversations. The Grubb family themselves, yeah, will have, concrete information about this. Anything else?
I really appreciated that distinction. And that was something that I had agreed with as well, that understanding the social context between that hierarchical structure, especially given the ability for a woman of that era to not fully act as an autonomous being on her own and is dependent on this head male figure for many things in the functioning of a household, that in today's modern context is so much, as you had said, Hope, as that structure has been dismantled and society has moved towards allowing individuals such as women to fully actualize themselves to a point within the system, as work still needs to be done, of course. But in today's modern sense, that, and even it says in the UDHR on Article 16, the third point, the family, I'm reading from it, it says, quote, "The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state," unquote. And so you could frame that in today's modern sense, where that there no distinction between the various members of the unit, that unit exists with all of those, say a family of four, with all of those individuals present. Mm-hmm. And you could say that the protection of that unit as that four-member entity, if one of those individuals were to be, say, missing, and you needed to you would then could say that by me having information on that individual, that helps to me maintain within my mind the sense that this unit is still intact, that this unit is still protected by knowing the status of that individual. Where if that person is missing, gone, and you are not receiving information from that person, the unit itself is fundamentally compromised. Originally, when there was four, there is now three. Thus, the unit is no longer what it was previously under that protected state. Mm-hmm. And that whole sense in our today's society, that marriage of the two individuals who enter into it is a partnership, is something that has been more actualized as individuals, such as women are able to sign for a credit card without husband's consent and so forth, that it changes to where every individual within the family unit should be seen as important, and that any person who would be missing from that would then have the unit itself would then be compromised and not what it was under the previous arrangement. But I agree, understanding the social context that Evelyn Grubb was in, that losing the head of the household the family unit is completely compromised, since if this person represents the sole means of financial support for the family unit to continue to exist as it previously had, that person missing and not knowing the status of that individual greatly endangers that family unit's ability to continue to function as it once had. And so, yeah, understanding that context from 1971, sort of just at the beginning of the second wave of feminism and so forth, is important. But no, the distinction of every individual sort of being within that realm of importance, I thought was very enlightening and important.
Yeah, and as we've been saying, like, we've been talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, okay, which, as we said earlier, applies not just in wartime, but in peacetime, number one. And as you're pointing out, Michael, it's like the family unit. So it doesn't even really matter if we're even talking about someone who's, when we're talking about what does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights do, it doesn't really matter whether someone has, quote, signed up with the government to fight, right? So that's irrelevant. This is more like there is something called a family. It is deserving of protection. And like when the unit becomes compromised, then we need to repair it. And this is the duty of members of the United Nations. I think this is a very important point. And as we've been saying, you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is working together with the Geneva Conventions, but we're just talking about the UDHR now. And it has nothing to do with like soldiers and war and so forth, that there is this thing that needs to be protected. And when it's compromised, something needs to be done. Randy, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, I'm just going to be difficult here for a moment.
Going to be?
Yeah. So like the hang up here is that the whereabouts of a family member or of all citizens of the world is something that it takes resources to collect data on and track and do something about. And, you know, like if I get on my bike and go up a mountain and die, someone has to come looking for me, first of all, and then report that information. And then that information needs to get conveyed to family members in a timely manner, according to this set of laws.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem is that's not always so straightforward. And I draw the distinction with the military situation because it does seem like there's a different burden of responsibility for keeping track of a soldier as compared to a hiker.
Sure, but that's when that involves the Geneva Conventions. We're just talking about the UDHR now. So yes, and when we talk about the different burdens and rights and duties, then we're going to get into like the laws of war and all of that. But the UDHR is not that.
Yeah, and so it's a good ideal, but you know, but we have to talk about it as if it's an ideal and not a given fact of nature that all governments ought to be able to do such a thing perfectly, right? Because
dream big.
Well, fine. Sign up for the sacrifice of all privacy in that case, right? So, I mean, because that's where the conflict starts to come in. Like, how is it supposed to be possible to always be able to track a person in order to provide location data to the families whenever it's, you know, deemed necessary?
So this is really good. And we're gonna, yeah, I appreciate, yeah, this, your quote, being difficult. And as I indicated, I question whether that you're becoming, you always have been, and wonderfully so. So this like tracking people and informing family members about the whereabouts. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, and I'm not going to go into it now because I think we should just be focused on the UDHR. But FYI, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and by the way, the Geneva Conventions that we always talk about when we say the Geneva Conventions, we're talking about 4 of them, and they became, they were formed in August of 1949, August 12th, 1949. So again, after World War II, it's like, we need to update, upgrade our laws of war, okay? Because we had like the stuff from the Hague Conventions and like the First Geneva Convention. We need to upgrade, like software, our international law of armed conflict. And one of the very significant upgrades was the Fourth Geneva Convention, completely new in 1949. And that purpose is to minimize the suffering of civilians. So not soldiers who sign up, but like everybody else, okay? And so it's not the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but again, like we're talking about a different class of people who aren't signing up, but are affected by armed conflict. So we're broadening the lens a bit. And I just want to say again, like this is perhaps a nice way to end and set up the next show, but there are like things in there, okay? The Fourth Geneva Convention, which is about just like civilians that pertain to the tracking of families. Now, of course, this is an armed conflict, but and it's the International Committee of the Red Cross that does this. Long story, so I just want to point it out now, okay? And so what we've been doing in this conversation is just like sort of broadening, like we're zooming out and zooming in, right? And so like zooming in is that very specific Geneva Convention, prisoners of war, Third Geneva Convention, okay? And like what rights are being violated here? And Evelyn points out, it's Article 121, where North Vietnam has got to communicate this information in a very specific way. They have agreed to do that. It's not like, should they? No, they agreed to do that. And they're not doing it. And the other thing is like, how is it possible that Cora Weiss can get this information, but like the State Department, like someone's able to get it. So like US government, do something, and like work, like do something. So that's the very specific, and then the UDHR, broadens this context. And again, there's this family and it needs to be protected. And what does that mean? And yeah, now you're like raising privacy, like great questions. And what trumps what in the hierarchy of values? Great questions. I also just want to throw in, and then, we'll be going for over an hour. So both of you should start to, form your summary thoughts, and we'll continue the discussion in the next show. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we're in June and this is Pride Month. And yes, it is all connected. It really is, because this like head of household patriarchal structure, one of the things that really helped in the dismantling of it are the marriage equality cases. And so like same-sex marriage equality, as it's called, those cases, so Obergefell versus Hodges, which I know, Michael, you have encountered because we talk about it in our class in moral problems. Justice Ginsburg, I believe, explicitly mentioned, look, like she calls it the law of coverture, where there's like a head of household. This doesn't exist anymore. Like it's time to do away with it. And this is like a partnership of equals. And so we can thank the marriage equality cases for like help. It's like the quote feminist cases, marriage equality cases have helped to change the legal background of family law, if you will. And so, family law in the 1970s is very, very different. And as it's Pride Month, I just wanted to give a nod to those developments. All right, well, we've been talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the fact that it does, contain specific articles that mention the family. The other articles that mention the family in the UDHR are Article 12, and it says, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, comma, family, comma, home or correspondence. So there's like, you can't be arbitrarily interfered with, your family cannot be. And then Article 20, although it doesn't mention family, it mentions everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. And so that right of association is really, really important. Well, you don't have time to go into it now. I'm just flagging those articles. So I think this is like a good place to wind down, because we've just been talking about the first contention in Evelyn Grubb's petition that mentions the UDHR, and in particular, this provision about the family being a fundamental unit of society that is deserving of protection. We've talked about how that plays into Evelyn Grubb's petition. And what we've said is that, but because the missing is the head of household, this is all the more deserving of protection. And it means knowing the truth with certainty when the status in question is the head of a family. So that was a mouthful. And we have not yet talked about the argument pertaining to the Geneva Convention, number 3, that's in the petition, but I think next time we can discuss that, as well as some other loose ends. Let me start with you, Michael, for summary thoughts, and then Randy, and then we'll close out for today.
I think this whole show is truly emblematic of the power of Evelyn Grubb's and her whole family story, really, that it starts off with something so visceral and so individualistic of something has happened to someone you love and care about deeply, and through a kernel of hope from the telephone call Evelyn receives from her friend that her husband is still alive, is the catalyst that sets her off on this immense journey that extends to the whole world, really, in trying to advocate and hold nations to account of their duty towards their citizens and to the family unit as a whole. And it starts off that what makes it so profound is it just hits on such an individual level for Evelyn and her family of wanting to just be reunited with her husband and then the children's father, but extends to something that then impacts the whole of humanity, and for every family unit, and for every family unit within the United States within the Vietnam War period who had an individual who was missing, whether it be a son or a father or what have you. And that is, in that act of her going to petition the United Nations, is a catalyst for many things, from the discussion of the family unit that we have been having, but also on these broad, very complex, so philosophical and important structures in documents like the UDHR and in the United Nations as a whole. And that has been like the story that we've been of Evelyn Grubb's activism in life. It is that catalyst for that discussion that we have been having. And it's just truly opens the mind up to so much and gives you so much food for thought and so much to ponder in what these international structures mean, even into a basic sense of debating like the meaning of law. What is a right? What is a duty? It is all encapsulated within this. And that is what I have found to be so profound and so resonant, on top of just the sheer drive, determination, and as Stephen Pressfield would say, stubbornness of individuals like Evelyn Grubb and the National League of POW MIA families to continue to labor for the accounting of the individuals who are missing or prisoners of war. And I would just end with extending an immense thank you and a most humbled and honored bow to the Grubb family and to Kevin Settle and the entire team, Shireen Husseini with the Fruits of Peace effort, that their work and getting to interact with the Grubb children directly has been extremely profound. And we are truly honored, and I feel extremely privileged to be able to partake in the dissemination of this incredibly meaningful story. And I've grown a lot from it. And I think that it's very profound.
Hear, hear.
So I just want to draw attention as a closing thought to the idea that the knowledge about the fate of a family member provides critical information for building future plans and building a life. And false hope is something that is a big problem. Uncertainty is something that's a big problem. And, it's something I said earlier, I want to repeat, like the question of what if, it can be really crippling. And so this kind of legal structure to try to keep those things as well maintained or as well under control, or, improve the situation as best as possible for families, it's a non-trivial situation. I don't think I've ever met someone who disputes the idea that the family unit is like the fundamentals building block of society. I know some people would say it's the individual and they have their reasons, but families are clearly important. It's like, I don't think anybody disputes that. And so the protections for the family unit and trying to do whatever possible to strengthen the family unit all across the board seems to be a good thing for everybody. And, of course, there's big, serious, important conversations about what a family is going to be defined as. And those just get stuck in the weeds at some point because, like we need to take care of the people in civilization. And how do you best address people in a civilization? Well, seems like a good place to start by taking care of families. So.
Right. And this came up when we first discussed this petition on Human Rights Day in 2020, December 10th, that was. The right of intimate association. So we talk about families. Maybe it makes more sense because we now make a distinction between family of origin and family of choice. So the family that you're born into is not necessarily the family that you stick with as your intimate associates. And so, yes, what I hear you saying, Randy, is like intimate associates. No one doubts the importance of them. And the United States courts, at the very least, are beginning to recognize, and I did mention this, I think, in our December 10th show, but I'll mention it again. The United States courts are beginning to recognize, so it's one thing for us to recognize it, but for the courts to recognize it, it's a different animal. But they're beginning to recognize that intimate associates are constitutive to the self and the personality. And of course, this goes back to our shows that we've just done on Howard Thurman and how, everything's connected and we're all connected to each other. And I can't be who I am until you become who you are. And my becoming is intimately related with your becoming, this idea. And so the Supreme Court in the United States is starting to recognize this sort of like metaphysical, shall we say truth, or shall we say point of view, that our intimate associates are constitutive of our personality. And our personality is, of course, at the heart of autonomy. And so if we care about autonomy, I would like to argue that, we need to really, act with great concern about when our intimate associates are compromised. That's all I have to say. Like, there are many loose ends on this show, which I think is good. It's a conversation that we will continue to have. And I will end it today. So yesterday, again, was the 50th anniversary of when Evelyn Grubb submits her petition to the United Nations. If you want to read some of the petition, it is in the book that we've been referring to, You Are Not Forgotten, by Evelyn Grubb and Carol Joes. Some of the petition is quoted in that book. and the book should be read by anyone. And so we will be back continuing this conversation. You've been listening to Virtues of Peace, and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.